Yuashutsu Yoyobi Tobo. Exit and flight from the Yoshiwara. The Yoshiwara Okogami says that going abroad of prostitutes was prohibited at the founding of the Yoshiwara, and only Teiyu were occasionally allowed to attend the Hyojosho, or Supreme Court, to wait on officials. In the case of a juro being summoned before the Machibugyo, she was accompanied by 2 wakimono, the master of the brothel, 5 wardsmen or goningumi, a representative of the nanushi, and her yaraite. The latter made a small present to the attendants of the bugyo that they might spread a mat for the juro to sit on, and the juro remained silent while the yaraite answered the questions of the judge. Once, in every spring, all the inmates of the brothel used to go out to either Yuno, Usakayame, or Mokojima to see the cherry blossoms, and on this occasion they spent the day in drinking sake under the cherry trees, and amusing themselves by dancing and other pastimes. The custom of the Teiyu appearing at the Hyojosho ceased about the era of the Kwani, 1624 to 1643, and that of cherry blossom viewing also dropped out of fashion after the Bunsei era of 1818 to 1829. Even after this latter date, sick prostitutes requiring the treatment of a physician outside the Yoshiwara, or those who wished to go to their master's villa for the benefit of their health, were allowed to pass through the gate. If the parents of prostitutes had lived at Asakusa and in its neighborhood were dangerously ill, they were allowed to visit them by the special permission of the Roshu. But even in those cases, the women were passed out under pretext of sickness, and a passport was given to them by the nanushi as follow: Courtesan so-and-so, implored by so-and-so, who is under my management being sick, is sent out to the great gateway or the Oman to visit Dr. So-and-so accompanied by her master. She is allowed to pass the gate without fail. Signed, so-and-so, with seal. A woman thus allowed out of the Yoshiwara would perhaps have looked out of her kago or planquin, as she was borne along through the streets, and wondered at the novelty of her surroundings. Then she might have become impatient, owing to her anxiety after her parents' health, and urged the kageyo or the bearers to hurry forward. Arriving at her parents' home, she would perhaps have found her father seriously ill, lying in squalid wretchedness, and have been met by her poor old mother, who, taking her daughter's hand in her own, might have been overcome with some deep emotion, and weep bitterly. Then came long consultations about the future, and the day of grace began to draw to a close, for it was a rule the courtesans out on leave had to return to the Yoshiwara before 5:30 p.m. By and by, the sad and solemn tones of the temple bell at Asakusa would give her warning that her time was expiring, and urged on by the Yarete, an old brothel hag, whom she had perforce brought with her, she rose and bade farewell to her weeping parents, and re-entering her kago was carried back to her life of gilded misery, well nigh blinded by an agony of helpless tears. Although the rules related to the passage of the Oman or the Great Gateway were as above, there were some prostitutes who attempted to run away from the Yoshiwara, owing to an irresistible desire to see their lovers, or being heavily in debt. When such an event happened, the brothel keeper concerned sent out men on all sides to trace the absconding woman, or applied to the police office, Membonsho, for her capture, and as detectives were immediately set to work to ascertain her whereabouts, nearly all runaway women were caught, and ignominiously brought back to their masters. When an absconder was brought back, she was censured for her ill-considered step by her master, her yarite, and the banto, and all the expenses incurred in the connection with her detection and capture were then added to her debt. This had the effect of prolonging the term of her servitude in the brothel. Sometimes private punishment was meted out by the master, if he thought she deserved it. When an elopement was attempted twice or thrice in succession, the woman in question was generally resold to one of the prostitute quarters outside the Yoshiwara through the agency of a zigan, or procurer. This practice was called kuragage, or the changing of saddles. It is said to have been the custom that when the keeper of a brothel outside the Yoshiwara was in treaty for the purchase of a Karage prostitute, he sent his banto to the house to which she belonged as an ordinary guest. The banto would spend the night with her, and the mi no shirakin, price of the body, was settled according to his report. Yujo byo shi oyobi joshi no koto, of the death and the double suicide of courtesans. The Yoshiwara Okogami says that as the life of a courtesan is generally spoken of as the painful world, it is really painful nature may be well imagined. Not only does a woman who has fallen into this unhappy position become a mere plaything to gratifying the lusts of immoral men, but her freedom is so curtailed by circumstances that she cannot even sleep and eat independently, and therefore often has her constitution ruined owing to her irregular mood of eating and drinking. Others fall sick by reason of excessive anxiety over monetary affairs, and others fall a prey to loathsome and perchance virtually incurable diseases. When a first-class prostitute or yoto no yujo is sick, if the master of the brothel had been too much an expense in curing her, he'd spare no pains to cure her illness. And if the matter was serious, the woman would be removed to the master's villa, which was situated, perhaps in the vicinity of the amado or sanya, for treatment. Such an individual would be closely attended by a kamuro or female page, and sometimes the master himself went to some temple to pray for her recovery. If, however, the yujo happened to belong to a lower class and was not particularly popular, the attitude of the brothel keeper would be entirely different, and the treatment of the girl would be simply entrusted to some quack doctor. The poor creature being meanwhile thrust into an out-of-the-way gloomy room, where she would pine away unseen by the other inmates of the house. When her condition was considered very precarious, the master, in order to avoid the trouble and expense involved in death, used to summon her parents and hand the sick woman over to them, together with her shomon, or document of engagement. When a yujo died in a brothel, the matter was reported by the monthly manager of the Yoshiwara to the nanushi, and the latter summoned her parents, or surety, to take delivery of her corpse. In the event of her parents being far away, the remains of the yujo were interred by the brothel keeper in the dotetsu, or the general burial place, upon the bank in the presence of her surety. This place was known as the nagekome, or the throwing-in place. There is an old poem illustrating the sad future which is in store for some of the unfortunate shogi. It runs, "She is hurried to the grave in a pauper coffin, with what one solitary little maid to mourn her." Alas, this description was only true in so many a case. Besides natural death, there were many yujo who committed suicide, together with their sweethearts, owing to various reasons, among which the most powerful were either their inability to live together in conjugal felicity with each other, or their pecuniary embarrassments. Such double suicides have been known as shinju, the inside of the heart or mind. But about the era of the Kyoho, 1716 to 1735, Judge Oko Inchin no Kami, who is regarded as the Japanese Solomon, gave it out as his opinion that the word shinju, if read reverse, would make kyushin, or loyalty, and that it was absurd to call the double suicide of a man and woman owing to love affairs loyalty. He therefore ordained that this kind of suicide should now be called atajini, or death by mutual consent, and that word was accordingly adopted. The later Mr. Kodozumi Yakumo, in his Glimpses of the Unfamiliar Japan, Volume 1, gives an extremely interesting example of shinju as follows. There lived in ancient times a hatamoto called Fujieda Geki, a vassal of the shogun. He had an income of 5,000 koku of rice, a great income in those days. But he fell in love with an inmate of the Yoshiwara named Eaguni, and wished to marry her. When his master bade the vassal choose between his fortune and his passion, the lovers fled secretly to a farmer's house, and there they did commit together The sad occurrence was commemorated in a popular song which ran, Kimi to kyo go shinki gaki toro ka, nan no go shin goku, kimi to nio. Once more to rest beside her, or keep live 1,000 koku. What care I for koku? Let me be with her. According to the Totu Kofun-shi, a record of the ancient tombs in the eastern capital, the Jokanji temple of Miniwa, Shitaya district, was the burial ground of the Yujo of the Yoshiwara. When the secret prostitutes of the city of Yedo were transported into the Yoshiwara, they were called Baijo, or sold women. Originally, the bodies of these women and other secret prostitutes were interred in the burial ground at this temple only, but later on it became the custom to bury their remains elsewhere, as also those of regular Yujo. The book goes on to say, in these burial places are to be found many graves of the Yujo, who did commit suicide with their paramours. On the tombstones are to be found engraved the description of the swords with which they killed themselves, as well as their names and their ages. There is something so weird and uncanny about these horribly pitiless records on the gray lichen-covered monuments that the blood of a sightseer runs cold, and he becomes so nervous that he leaves the gloomy spot with the intention of never visiting it again.